The sound of a woman's voice drifting across his barley field made Vincent Vance freeze mid-swing, his axe suspended above the stubborn fence post he had been trying to split since dawn. The sun hung low over his Montana property in that golden hour before dusk, and for a moment he thought perhaps the loneliness had finally driven him to hearing things that were not there. But no, there it was again, a melody so pure and haunting that it seemed to make the very air shimmer with beauty. Vincent set down his axe carefully, wiping the sweat from his brow with a worn handkerchief as he squinted toward the source of the singing. His land stretched out in waves of amber and gold, the barley swaying gently in the early evening breeze of this September day in 1884. He had worked this property alone for 3 years now, ever since his father had passed and left him the deed to these 400 acres just outside of a settlement too small to have earned a proper name yet. Most folks just called it the Crossroads, being that it sat where 2 cattle trails met on the way to bigger towns. The voice grew clearer as Vincent walked slowly through his field, boots crushing the dry earth beneath them. It was a woman's voice, young and strong, singing something that sounded like a hymn but with words he could not quite make out. His heart pounded strangely in his chest, partly from surprise at finding someone on his land, but mostly from the sheer beauty of the sound washing over him. He crested a small rise in the land, and there she was, standing in the middle of his field with her back to him, arms spread wide as if embracing the sky itself. She wore a simple dress the color of faded roses, and her dark hair hung down her back in a long braid that swayed as she sang. Vincent stopped walking, suddenly uncertain whether he should interrupt something that felt almost sacred. The woman's song rose and fell like the wind, and Vincent found himself unable to move, transfixed by the power of her voice. He had heard plenty of singing in his 26 years, church hymns and saloon songs and the work songs of ranch hands, but nothing had ever struck him quite like this. The melody seemed to reach inside his chest and touch something that had been cold and dormant for far too long. When the song finally ended, the silence that followed felt almost painful. The woman lowered her arms and turned slowly, as if she had known all along that someone was watching. Her eyes met his across the distance, and even from where he stood, Vincent could see that they were a remarkable shade of green, like new spring grass. "I am sorry," she called out, her speaking voice as musical as her singing had been. "I did not think anyone would hear me out here." Vincent found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "This is my land, though you are welcome to sing on it any time you please." The woman smiled, and Vincent felt his breath catch. She began walking toward him, moving gracefully through the barley stalks. As she drew closer, he could see that she was perhaps 22 or 23, with a face that was more striking than classically pretty, all strong bones and expressive features. There was a weariness in her eyes that spoke of hard times, but her smile seemed genuine. "My name is Grace Zimmerman," she said when she reached him, extending her hand in a forthright manner that surprised him. "I arrived in the area 3 days ago, and I have been walking the countryside trying to find work. Your field looked so beautiful in the evening light that I could not resist stopping to rest and sing a while. Music has always been my comfort." Vincent took her hand, noting the calluses on her palm that spoke of a life that had not been easy. "Vincent Vance, I own this property." "Where did you come from, Miss Zimmerman?" Grace's smile faltered slightly. "Kansas originally. My father had a small farm there, but he died last winter. I have been traveling since spring, looking for a place to settle and make a living. I heard there might be work in Montana, but so far I have found nothing." "What kind of work are you looking for?" Vincent asked, though he already suspected he knew the answer. There were not many options for women alone in this territory. "Anything honest," Grace replied, lifting her chin as if daring him to suggest otherwise. "I can cook, clean, sew, tend animals, work a garden. I can read and write and do figures. I am not afraid of hard work." Vincent considered her for a long moment. His property was prosperous enough, but running it alone had been grinding him down slowly. He woke before dawn and worked until he could barely see, then fell into bed too exhausted to do more than sleep. He had no time for the things that made life worth living, no time to do anything but survive. The house his father had built was large enough for a family, but Vincent rattled around in it like a dried pea in a tin can. "I could use help," he said slowly. "The harvest is coming and I am behind on nearly everything, but I should tell you straight that I cannot afford to pay much in wages." Grace's eyes brightened with hope. "Room and board would be enough for now if you have space, and perhaps a small wage once the harvest is sold." Vincent nodded, already knowing he was making a decision that would change everything, though he could not have said exactly how he knew this. "There is a room off the kitchen that was meant to be a hired hand's quarters. It has a good door with a lock, and I give you my word that you would be safe under my roof. I am not a man who would take advantage." "I can see that," Grace said simply. "You have kind eyes." They walked back to the house together as the sun finally slipped below the horizon, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed especially vivid that evening. Vincent found himself acutely aware of Grace's presence beside him. The way she moved, the soft sound of her breathing, the rustle of her skirts against the dry grass. The house was a sturdy two-story structure built from timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and side. Vincent had always been proud of it, but now seeing it through a stranger's eyes, he noticed all the small signs of neglect, the peeling paint and the overgrown flower beds that his mother had once tended with such care. "It is a beautiful home," Grace said, and Vincent heard no false flattery in her tone. "I can see it was built with love." "My father and mother built it together," Vincent replied, leading her up the porch steps. "They came to Montana in '68, right after they married. It was wild country then, even more than it is now. My father used to say that my mother was the bravest woman in the territory, willing to make a life out here with nothing but hope and hard work to sustain them." Grace smiled. "She sounds like she was remarkable." "She was," Vincent agreed, opening the front door. "She died when I was 15. Fever took her one winter. My father never quite recovered from losing her, though he lived another 11 years. The interior of the house was dim and cool, and Vincent lit a lamp to chase away the shadows. The main room was large and open, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall and a heavy wooden table surrounded by mismatched chairs in the center. There were doors leading off to other rooms, and a staircase against the far wall led up to the second floor. "The kitchen is through there," Vincent said, gesturing to one of the doors. "And your room is just beyond it. I sleep upstairs, so you would have privacy on this floor. There is a pump in the kitchen for water and an outhouse about 50 yards behind the house. I have been meaning to dig a new one closer, but I have not found the time." Grace set down the small canvas bag she had been carrying, her only possession in the world as far as Vincent could tell. "It is more than I had hoped to find. Thank you, Mr. Vance." "Vincent," he corrected. "We do not need to stand on formality if we are going to be living under the same roof." "Then you must call me Grace," she replied. They stood there for a moment in the lamplight, two lonely people who had stumbled into each other's lives by chance or fate or providence. Vincent felt something stirring in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the mild September evening. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "I was going to make some supper. Nothing fancy, but there is bacon and beans and some bread I bought from the widow Parsons down the road." "Let me cook," Grace said immediately. "You have been working all day. The least I can do is prepare a meal." Vincent started to protest, but the hopeful look in her eyes stopped him. He realized that she needed to feel useful to begin earning her keep immediately. "All right," he agreed. "I will show you where everything is." They moved into the kitchen together, and Vincent found himself very aware of the domestic intimacy of the moment, standing beside Grace as she examined his meager pantry and made plans for a simple meal. She moved efficiently, clearly experienced in making something out of very little. Soon the smell of frying bacon filled the kitchen, and Vincent set about laying the table in the main room. When they finally sat down to eat, the food tasted better than anything Vincent had eaten in months. It was not that Grace had done anything particularly special with the simple ingredients, but there was something about sharing a meal with another person, about not eating alone in the darkening house with only his own thoughts for company. "Tell me about your father's farm in Kansas," Vincent said as they ate. "What was it like there?" Grace's expression grew wistful. "It was never very prosperous. The land was not as good as what I have seen here in Montana. My father struggled every year to make enough to pay his debts. But he loved that land, loved working it with his own hands. My mother died when I was born, so it was just the two of us for as long as I can remember. He taught me everything he knew about farming and animals and making do with what you have." "You have any other family?" Grace shook her head. "None that I know of. My father was an only child, and my mother's family never approved of their marriage. After she died, they wanted nothing to do with me. It has just been me since my father passed." Vincent heard the loneliness in her voice, an echo of his own solitude. "I am sorry. It is hard, losing your parents. Even when you are grown, it leaves a hole." "Yes," Grace agreed softly. "That is exactly what it is like, a hole that nothing seems to fill." They finished the meal in companionable silence, and afterward Grace insisted on cleaning up while Vincent went to check on his 2 horses and make sure they were settled for the night. When he returned to the house, he found Grace standing in the main room, looking at the photographs that hung on the wall beside the fireplace. "Is this your mother?" she asked, pointing to a faded photograph of a woman with a strong face and gentle eyes. "Yes. That was taken just a few months before she died, and that is my father beside her." Grace studied the photographs with real interest. They looked very happy together. "They were," Vincent said. "Even through all the hard times they had each other. My father used to say that a man could endure anything as long as he had a good woman beside him." Grace turned to look at him, and something passed between them in that moment, some recognition or understanding that neither of them was quite ready to name. Vincent felt his pulse quicken and forced himself to look away. "It has been a long day," he said, his voice a bit rougher than usual. "I should let you get some rest. We will start early tomorrow. There is much to do before the harvest." "Of course," Grace said. "Good night, Vincent." "Good night, Grace." Vincent climbed the stairs to his room, but sleep was a long time coming. He lay in his bed listening to the sounds of the house, aware as he had not been in years of another person's presence beneath his roof. He thought about Grace's voice singing across his field, about the way her eyes had lit up when he offered her a place to stay, about the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with someone who understood loneliness as well as he did. He finally drifted off near midnight, and his dreams were full of music. The next morning, Vincent woke to the smell of coffee and frying eggs, and for a moment he thought he was still dreaming. He dressed quickly and came downstairs to find Grace already up and working in the kitchen, her hair pinned up and her sleeves rolled to her elbows. "I hope you do not mind that I started breakfast," she said when she saw him. I have always been an early riser. Mind. It is the best thing that has happened to me in 3 years, Vincent replied honestly. The simple act of having someone else in the house, of not facing another day entirely alone, filled him with a lightness he had almost forgotten was possible. They ate breakfast as the sun rose, painting the Montana landscape in shades of gold and amber, and then set to work together. Vincent showed Grace around the property, explaining what needed to be done and when. She asked intelligent questions and remembered everything he told her, and by mid-morning, they had fallen into an easy rhythm of working side by side. Grace proved to be as capable as she had claimed. She mucked out the horses' stalls without complaint, fed the chickens Vincent kept for eggs, and weeded the overgrown vegetable garden behind the house with steady determination. But it was during their lunch break, when Grace began to sing softly while she prepared their meal, that Vincent truly understood what a gift had walked into his life. Her voice transformed the simple act of slicing bread and cheese into something beautiful. Vincent found himself pausing in the doorway just to listen, struck again by the pure quality of her singing. When Grace noticed him watching, she stopped abruptly, color rising in her cheeks. "I am sorry. I sing without thinking sometimes. I know it can be annoying." "Annoying." Vincent shook his head firmly. "Grace, your voice is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. Please do not stop singing on my account. This house has been too quiet for too long." Grace looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "My father used to say that my singing was the only wealth he had to give me. He hoped that someday I might use it to make a better life." "What did he mean by that?" Grace shrugged. "He thought perhaps I could sing in a church somewhere or teach music. But those opportunities are hard to come by for a woman without connections or education. Most places I traveled through, they took one look at me and offered me work in saloons or dance halls, singing songs I did not want to sing for men who had no interest in the music itself." Vincent heard the bitterness in her voice and understood. The frontier was not an easy place for women alone, and the options available to them were often harsh and unforgiving. "You will never have to do that kind of work," he said. "Not while you are here." Grace met his eyes. "You are a good man, Vincent Vance." "I am just a man who knows good fortune when it walks into his life," Vincent replied. The days that followed fell into a pattern that felt surprisingly natural. Vincent and Grace worked together from dawn until dusk, bringing in the barley harvest and preparing the property for winter. Grace proved invaluable, not just for her labor but for her companionship. The work that had felt like drudgery when Vincent did it alone became something different with Grace beside him, something almost enjoyable. And always, there was the singing. Grace sang while she worked, sang while she cooked, sang in the evenings when the day's labor was done, and they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the distant mountains. Her voice became the soundtrack to Vincent's life, filling all the empty spaces that had yawned so cold and hollow before her arrival. Vincent found himself learning the songs she sang, joining in sometimes with his own rough baritone. Grace seemed delighted when he did this, and she began teaching him harmonies, their voices blending together in the gathering dusk. Those moments felt almost unbearably intimate to Vincent, as if through music they were sharing something deeper than words could express. He was falling in love with her. He knew this with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him. Every day Grace became more essential to him, not just as a worker but as a presence, a person who understood him in ways he had never been understood before. He caught himself watching her as she moved through her tasks, admiring the grace of her movements, the way the sunlight caught in her dark hair, the sound of her laughter when something amused her. but Vincent had no idea if Grace felt anything similar. She was friendly and warm, but she treated him with a kind of careful propriety that made it hard for him to read her true feelings. He told himself that she was simply being appropriate, that she was living under his roof and dependent on him for her livelihood, and could not afford to be too familiar. But the uncertainty gnawed at him. 3 weeks after Grace's arrival, Vincent made the trip to the nearest town of any size, a place called Dawson about 15 miles east, to sell some of his barley harvest and buy supplies. Grace asked if she could come along, explaining that she needed a few personal items she could not ask Vincent to purchase for her. Vincent hitched up his wagon and they set off in the early morning, the autumn air crisp and cool. The journey gave them hours to talk, and Vincent found himself telling Grace things he had never spoken of to anyone. About his dreams of making the ranch truly prosperous, about his loneliness in the years since his father's death, about his fear that he would end up alone and forgotten, just another failed homesteader whose bones would bleach under the Montana sun. Grace listened with complete attention, and when Vincent finally fell silent, she reached over and laid her hand briefly on his arm. "You will not fail," she said quietly. "You have too much heart for that, and you are not alone anymore." The simple touch, the warmth of her hand through his shirt sleeve, sent electricity through Vincent's entire body. He looked at Grace and saw color rising in her cheeks, saw the way she quickly withdrew her hand and looked away. His heart pounded. Could she possibly feel what he was feeling? They reached Dawson near midday and set about their errands. The town was bustling with activity, full of ranchers and farmers bringing in their harvests, miners restocking their supplies before winter set in, and all the usual frontier commerce. Vincent sold his barley for a good price, feeling a satisfaction he had not experienced in years. With Grace's help, the harvest had come in early and in excellent condition. While Grace went to the general store to make her purchases, Vincent stopped by the post office and was surprised to find a letter waiting for him. It was from a cousin he barely knew, living back in St. Louis, informing him that a distant uncle had died and left Vincent a small inheritance, about $200. It was not a fortune, but it was more money than Vincent had ever had at one time. He stood in the street reading the letter, his mind racing with possibilities. $200 could buy equipment he desperately needed, or livestock, or could be saved against future hardship. But as he folded the letter and put it in his pocket, Vincent found himself thinking of other possibilities, possibilities that centered around a young woman with a voice like an angel. He found Grace outside the general store, looking at a posting board where people advertised jobs and services. She seemed troubled, and when Vincent approached, she pointed to one of the notices. "There is a church in Helena looking for a music teacher," she said quietly. "They are offering $30 a month plus room and board." Vincent felt his stomach drop. Helena was 200 miles away. "Are you thinking of applying?" Grace looked at him and her eyes were troubled. "I do not know. It is a good opportunity, the kind my father always hoped I would find, but—" "But what?" Vincent prompted, hardly daring to breathe. "But I am happy where I am," Grace said simply. "Happier than I have been in years, maybe ever. I love the work on your land, love the freedom of it, love—" She trailed off, looking flustered. "Love what?" Vincent asked, his voice rough with emotion. Grace met his eyes. "Love singing with you in the evenings. Love the way you listen as if my voice matters. Love feeling like I belong somewhere." Vincent's heart was hammering so hard he was sure Grace must be able to hear it. They were standing in the middle of Dawson's main street with people passing all around them, but he felt as if they were completely alone. "Grace," he began, then stopped, not sure how to say what he needed to say. "We should get back," Grace said, looking away. "The day is wearing on." They loaded the supplies into the wagon and began the journey home. The ride back was different from the ride there, charged with an unspoken tension that made the air feel thick. Vincent tried several times to find the words to tell Grace how he felt, but each time his courage failed him. When they finally reached the ranch as the sun was setting, Grace climbed down from the wagon quickly and began helping Vincent unload the supplies. They worked in silence, and the weight of all the unsaid words between them felt almost unbearable. Finally, with the wagon unloaded and the horses unhitched and brushed down, they stood in the yard as full darkness settled over the land. The stars were coming out overhead, brilliant in the clear Montana sky. "Grace," Vincent said, his voice steady despite the fear hammering in his chest. "I need to tell you something." Grace turned to face him, her face pale in the starlight. "What is it?" Vincent took a deep breath. "I have fallen in love with you. I know I have no right, that you came here looking for work and safety, not for some lonely cowboy to burden you with his feelings. But I cannot let another day pass without telling you the truth. Your voice has become the music of my life, but it is not just your singing. It is you, everything about you. The way you work, the way you laugh, the way you understand silence as well as words. I love you, Grace Zimmerman, and I think I started loving you the moment I heard you singing in my field." Grace stared at him, her eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. For a long moment she said nothing, and Vincent felt his heart begin to sink. Then she stepped forward and took his hands in hers. "Vincent," she said, her voice shaking, "I have been so afraid to hope. I love you too. I think I have loved you since that first night when you offered me shelter without asking for anything in return. Every day I wake up grateful that I found your field, that I stopped to sing, that you heard me. I am not interested in teaching music in Helena or anywhere else. I want to stay here with you if you will have me." Vincent felt as if he could not breathe. "If I will have you." "Grace, having you here has been the greatest blessing of my life, but I want more than just having you work for me. I want—" He paused, then forged ahead. "I want to marry you if you will have me. I know it is too soon, that we have only known each other 3 weeks, but I am certain of this as I have never been certain of anything. I love you and I want to build a life with you." Grace was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you. I know my own heart, Vincent, and my heart is yours." Vincent pulled her into his arms, and Grace came willingly, pressing her face against his chest. He held her tightly, hardly able to believe that this was real, that this remarkable woman loved him back. When Grace finally pulled back to look up at him, Vincent bent his head and kissed her, their first kiss, soft and tender and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both of them were shaking. Grace laughed, a sound of pure joy. "This is really happening. I cannot quite believe it." "Believe it," Vincent said, smiling wider than he had smiled in years. "We are going to be married." They stood there in the starlight, holding each other, and Grace began to sing softly, a song Vincent did not recognize, but that sounded like happiness given voice. He joined in, humming the melody, their voices twining together in the darkness. The next weeks passed in a blur of joy and preparation. Vincent and Grace decided to marry quickly, seeing no reason to wait when they were both certain of their feelings. Vincent rode to Dawson and spoke with the circuit judge who passed through the area once a month, arranging for him to perform the ceremony on his next visit. In the meantime, Vincent gave Grace money from his inheritance to buy fabric and make a proper wedding dress. She protested that she did not need anything fancy, but Vincent insisted. "I want you to have something beautiful," he said, "something you will remember for the rest of your life." Grace seemed touched by his thoughtfulness and spent her evenings sewing by lamplight, creating a dress of pale blue cotton that brought out the green in her eyes. Vincent meanwhile cleaned and repaired the house from top to bottom, wanting everything to be perfect for Grace as his wife. They invited the few neighbors who lived within reasonable traveling distance to witness the ceremony, and to Vincent's surprise, a dozen people agreed to come. He realized that he had been more isolated than he thought, that in his loneliness, he had withdrawn from the small community around him. Grace's presence was already changing that, opening him up to the world again. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late October, with the fall colors blazing all around them and the air crisp and cold. Grace looked beautiful in her blue dress with her dark hair pinned up and flowers woven into it, flowers she had found still blooming in sheltered spots around the property. The ceremony itself was simple but moving. The circuit judge, a man named William Hartley who had been performing frontier weddings for 30 years, spoke about love and commitment and building a life together through hardship and joy. Vincent made his vows in a clear voice, promising to love and honor Grace for all his days, and Grace promised the same, her voice steady despite the tears shining in her eyes. When Judge Hartley pronounced them married, Vincent kissed his bride with all the love and tenderness in his heart, and the small gathering of neighbors cheered. Grace had prepared a feast with Vincent's help, and they all sat down together to celebrate, the house filled with laughter and conversation for the first time in years. After the guests had departed, Vincent and Grace stood together in the quiet house, suddenly shy with each other despite all the weeks of easy companionship. "Mrs. Vance," Vincent said softly, testing out the sound of it. Grace smiled. "I never thought I would have a new name." "It sounds strange but good." "It sounds perfect to me," Vincent replied. He held out his hand. "Shall we?" Grace took his hand, and together they climbed the stairs to the room that would now be theirs to share. Vincent had spent the previous day moving Grace's few belongings up from the small room off the kitchen and preparing the master bedroom, changing the linens and setting out fresh flowers. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, two lonely people who had found each other learning how to be truly together. Afterward, they lay in the darkness talking quietly, making plans for the future. "I want to expand the property," Vincent said. "With the money from the inheritance and the harvest, we could buy more land, run some cattle along with the crops. In a few years, we could have a real ranch." "That sounds wonderful," Grace agreed. "And children, Vincent, I want to fill this house with children." "How many?" Vincent asked, amused. "At least 4, Grace said decisively. "I hated being an only child. I want our children to have brothers and sisters, to never be alone the way we were." 4 children, Vincent mused. "That is a large family." "Too large?" Grace asked, suddenly uncertain. "No," Vincent said, pulling her close. "It sounds perfect. Let us fill this house with children and love and music." Grace kissed him. "Music especially. I will teach them all to sing." "Then we will be the loudest family in Montana," Vincent said, and Grace laughed, the sound like bells in the darkness. The winter that followed was the happiest time Vincent had ever known. He and Grace worked together to prepare the ranch for the harsh Montana cold, bringing in the last of the harvest and making sure they had enough supplies to last until spring. They spent the long dark evenings sitting by the fire, Grace sewing while Vincent carved small toys and tools, both of them singing together or simply talking. When the first heavy snow came in December, Vincent woke to find Grace standing at the bedroom window, watching the white flakes fall from the gray sky. "It is so beautiful," she said softly. "I have always loved snow." Vincent came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I am glad. We get a lot of it here." Grace leaned back against him. "Vincent, I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made Vincent's heart skip. "What is it?" Grace turned in his arms to face him, her eyes bright. "I am with child. I am certain of it now. We are going to have a baby." Vincent felt as if his heart might burst with joy. He lifted Grace off her feet and spun her around, making her laugh and protest. "A baby, Grace, that is wonderful news. You are happy?" Grace asked, though the answer was obvious from his face. "Happy? I am overjoyed." Vincent set her down carefully, then placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our child, growing right here." Grace covered his hand with hers. "I think it will be a boy. I have a feeling. Boy or girl, it will be loved beyond measure," Vincent said. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter. Grace continued to work alongside Vincent, though he insisted she not overexert herself. Her voice seemed to grow even more beautiful as her body changed, and she sang constantly to the baby growing inside her. In February, when the worst of the winter had passed, Vincent made the journey to Dawson to collect supplies and mail. He returned with a letter that made Grace's eyes fill with tears. It was from a music professor at a college in Boston, responding to an inquiry Vincent had sent months earlier, before he had even met Grace. The professor was interested in hearing about talented singers in the Western Territories and invited them to send a recording if one could be arranged. "You wrote to a music professor about me?" Grace asked, stunned. Vincent looked embarrassed. "I should have asked your permission first, but I heard you sing that first evening and I thought the world should know about your voice." "I wrote to several places, actually, music schools and theaters and the like. I never expected anyone to respond." Grace read the letter again, her expression complicated. "What would this mean? If I sent him a recording?" "I do not know," Vincent admitted. "Maybe nothing. Maybe he would be interested in your coming to Boston to study or to sing publicly. But Grace, that is your choice to make. I will never push you in a direction you do not want to go." Grace set the letter aside and took Vincent's hands. "I appreciate what you did, truly. But I have everything I want right here. My voice is not meant for concert halls and music schools. It is meant for this house, for our baby, for you. That is enough for me. That is everything." Vincent kissed her tenderly. "Are you certain?" "Completely certain," Grace replied. "The music of my life is here." The baby was born in June as the Montana summer was beginning to blaze hot and golden. Grace went into labor early in the morning, and Vincent rode hard to fetch the midwife from 3 miles away. The midwife, a tough old woman named Martha Cassidy, who had delivered half the babies in the territory, arrived in time to help Grace through the long, difficult process of bringing new life into the world. Vincent waited downstairs, pacing the floor and trying not to imagine all the things that could go wrong. When he finally heard the thin wail of a baby crying, he nearly collapsed with relief. Martha appeared at the top of the stairs, smiling. "Come and meet your son," she said. Vincent took the stairs 2 at a time and burst into the bedroom. Grace was propped up against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. She looked up as Vincent entered, tears streaming down her face. "Vincent, come and see him. Our son." Vincent approached the bed carefully, awed by the sight of his wife and child. Grace pulled back the blanket to reveal a tiny red face, eyes scrunched shut and mouth open in indignant crying. Vincent felt his own eyes fill with tears. "He is perfect," Vincent whispered. "Absolutely perfect." "I told you it would be a boy," Grace said with tired satisfaction. "What shall we name him?" Vincent had been thinking about this for months. "What about Nathaniel? It was my grandfather's name." Grace smiled. "Nathaniel Vance, I love it." She held out the baby to Vincent. "Hold your son." Vincent took the baby with trembling hands, terrified of dropping or hurting this impossibly fragile creature. But as soon as he held Nathaniel against his chest, something shifted inside him. This was his son, his and Grace's together, a new life born of their love. The responsibility was staggering, but so was the joy. Grace began to sing softly, a lullaby that Vincent had never heard before. Nathaniel stopped crying and seemed to turn his tiny head toward the sound of his mother's voice. Vincent looked at Grace and saw his whole world reflected in her eyes, their past, their present, their future, all bound together by love and music. The months that followed were exhausting but wonderful. Nathaniel was a healthy baby with strong lungs and an even stronger will. Grace took to motherhood with the same determined capability she brought to everything, though Vincent could see the toll that the constant demands of an infant took on her. He helped as much as he could, walking the floors with Nathaniel when he cried at night, changing his cloths, marveling at every tiny change and development. Grace continued to sing, and Vincent noticed that Nathaniel seemed to respond to her voice from the very beginning, calming immediately when she began a song. "He has your musical gift," Vincent said one evening as they watched their son fall asleep to the sound of Grace's lullaby. "I hope so," Grace replied. "I hope all our children love music." They had more children, as Grace had wished. A daughter named Sarah arrived 2 years after Nathaniel with Grace's dark hair and Vincent's brown eyes. Then another son, James, born just 14 months after Sarah. The house that had once echoed with emptiness filled with the sound of children's laughter and crying, running feet, and the constant music of Grace's singing. Vincent expanded the ranch as he had planned, buying more land and bringing in cattle. The work was hard but rewarding, and with Grace's partnership and support, the ranch became increasingly prosperous. They hired hands to help during the busy seasons, and Vincent found that he had a talent for managing both land and people. By 1890, 6 years after Grace had first appeared singing in his field, the Vance Ranch was one of the most successful operations in that part of Montana. Vincent and Grace had earned respect and friendship in the growing community, and their home became known as a place of welcome and hospitality. Grace started a small church choir, teaching the ranchers' wives and children to sing together, and their voices could be heard every Sunday rising up in praise. Through it all, Grace continued to sing. She sang while she worked, sang to her children, sang with Vincent in the evenings when the day's labor was done. Her voice remained as beautiful as the day Vincent had first heard it, and it became the defining feature of their family. Neighbors would comment that you could always tell when you were approaching the Vance property, because you would hear singing long before you saw the house. Vincent never forgot the miracle of that September evening, when he had heard a woman's voice drifting across his barley field. Sometimes he thought about the chain of events that had brought Grace to his land, all the hardships and losses that had driven her west, the timing that had placed her in his field at exactly the right moment. It could so easily not have happened. Grace could have walked a different direction, or Vincent could have been working elsewhere on his property, or any of 1,000 other variables could have changed and they never would have met. But they had met, and everything else had followed from that one moment of connection. Vincent believed with his whole heart that Providence had been at work that day, bringing 2 lonely souls together and weaving their lives into one. In the spring of 1891, Grace found herself pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the others had been, and the midwife warned them that Grace needed to rest more and work less. Vincent hired a woman from town to help with the housework, and insisted that Grace spend her days resting and caring for herself. Grace chafed at the restrictions, but she complied for the sake of the baby. She spent her time sewing and reading to the children, and of course, singing. Vincent would come in from working the land to find Grace sitting in the rocking chair by the window, her hands folded over her swollen belly, singing softly while Nathaniel, Sarah, and James played on the floor at her feet. The baby was born in October, another daughter they named Catherine. The birth was difficult and dangerous, and for a few terrifying hours, Vincent thought he might lose both Grace and the baby. But Martha Cassidy proved her worth once again, and both mother and daughter survived, though Grace was weak for weeks afterward. "No more babies," Vincent told Grace as he sat beside her bed, holding her hand. "I will not risk losing you," Grace smiled wanly. "4 children, that is what I said I wanted, and that is what we have. I am content." She recovered slowly but completely, and by the time Catherine was 6 months old, Grace was back to her full strength and energy. The house was chaotic with 4 young children, but it was the chaos of life and love, and both Vincent and Grace thrived in it. As the children grew, they all showed different personalities and talents. Nathaniel, the oldest, was serious and studious, with a gift for working with animals that rivaled Vincent's own. Sarah was wild and adventurous, always climbing trees and exploring the countryside. James was gentle and artistic, drawing elaborate pictures of the ranch and the mountains. And Catherine, even as a baby, showed signs of having inherited her mother's voice. Her babbling had a musical quality that made Grace light up with delight. Vincent taught his sons everything he knew about ranching and farming, while Grace taught all the children to read and write and do mathematics. But more than anything, she taught them to sing. Every evening after dinner, the family would gather around the piano that Vincent had bought from a traveling merchant and hauled all the way from Billings, and they would sing together, their voices blending in harmony. Those evenings became Vincent's favorite time. After a long day of hard work, to sit in his home surrounded by his wife and children, all of them singing together, felt like a small piece of heaven on earth. He would catch Grace's eye across the room and see his own contentment reflected back at him, and he would send up a silent prayer of gratitude for the blessing of this life. The years passed in the way that years do, sometimes slowly and sometimes far too quickly. The children grew and changed, the ranch continued to prosper, and Vincent and Grace's love for each other deepened with each passing season. They had their share of hardships, harsh winters and dry summers, illness and accidents and the constant challenges of frontier life. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. In 1895, when Nathaniel was 11 and Catherine was 4, a traveling photographer passed through the area, and Vincent hired him to take a family portrait. They all dressed in their Sunday best and stood together on the porch, Grace and Vincent in the center with the 4 children arranged around them. The photographer told them to hold still and look serious, but just before he triggered the shutter, Catherine began to sing, and the whole family broke into smiles. The resulting photograph captured them perfectly, a family bound together by love and joy, the Montana landscape stretching out behind them into infinity. Vincent had the photograph framed and hung it in the main room where everyone could see it. As the century drew toward its close, Vincent found himself reflecting often on the passage of time and the unexpected paths that life could take. He was 41 years old now, his hair beginning to gray at the temples, his hands permanently marked by years of hard work. Grace was 36, still beautiful, though the years and the bearing of children had left their mark on her as well. But when Grace sang, she sounded exactly as she had that first evening when Vincent had heard her voice drifting across his field. Her voice had not aged or diminished, and it remained the center of their family's life, the thread that bound them all together. One evening in the summer of 1899, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while the children played in the yard, Vincent took Grace's hand and squeezed it gently. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, knowing him well enough to read his moods. "About how different my life would have been if you had not stopped to sing in my field that day," Vincent replied. "I would have gone on alone, working myself into the ground, never knowing what I was missing." Grace smiled. "I think about that too. Sometimes I try to remember what I was singing that day, but I cannot quite recall. It hardly matters, I suppose. Whatever the song was, it brought me to you." "It brought us to each other," Vincent corrected. "We saved each other, Grace." "I believe that with all my heart." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "So do I. I was so lost when I came here, Vincent. I had nothing, no family, no home, no hope. And you gave me everything. You gave me a reason to sing." "Your voice became the music of my life," Vincent said softly. "That has never changed. Every day I wake up grateful that I get to hear you sing." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. In the yard, Nathaniel was teaching Sarah how to throw a rope while James sketched the scene and Catherine danced around them singing to herself. "We built something good here," Grace said. "A family, a home, a life. This is what my father wanted for me, even if he never could have imagined exactly what form it would take." "My parents would have loved you," Vincent said, "and they would have been so proud of our children, of everything we have accomplished together." Grace lifted her head to look at him. "Do you have any regrets, Vincent? Anything you wish had been different?" Vincent considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally. "I wish we could have had more time, that life was not so short and the years did not pass so quickly. But regrets? No. Every choice I have made since the day I met you has led to this, and this is more than I ever dared to dream of." Grace kissed him softly. "I feel the same way." As the 20th century dawned, the Vance family welcomed it with hope and excitement. Nathaniel, now 16, was beginning to talk about his own dreams for the future, about expanding the ranch even further or perhaps starting his own spread. Sarah, at 14, was becoming a skilled rider and showed an interest in breeding horses. James, at 13, was torn between his love of art and his sense of duty to the family ranch. And Catherine, at 8, sang constantly and begged her mother to teach her more complex songs. Vincent and Grace watched their children growing into young adults with pride and some melancholy. They knew that soon the children would begin leaving, creating lives of their own, and the house would grow quieter. But they also knew that this was the natural order of things, that children were meant to grow and fly away, and that their job as parents was to prepare them for that flight. In the fall of 1902, they had an unexpected visitor. A man arrived at the ranch driving a fancy carriage, dressed in city clothes that looked wildly out of place in the Montana countryside. He introduced himself as Professor Richard Alderson from the Boston Conservatory of Music. "I have been trying to track down a singer named Grace Zimmerman for years," he explained as he sat in their main room drinking coffee. "I received a letter about her back in '84, but when I replied, I never heard back. Then recently I happened to mention the matter to a colleague, and he had heard of a woman in Montana with an extraordinary voice. It took me some time to locate you." Grace and Vincent exchanged glances. "I received your letter," Grace said, "but my life had changed by then. I had married Vincent and we were expecting our first child. I never responded because I was not interested in pursuing a musical career." Professor Alderson looked disappointed but intrigued. "Would you sing for me now?" I have come a very long way, and I would hate to go back without at least hearing the voice that has haunted me for 18 years. Grace hesitated, then nodded. What would you like to hear? Anything you wish. Grace stood and began to sing, a hymn she had been practicing with the church choir. Her voice filled the room with beauty and power, and Vincent watched Professor Alderson's face transform, his disappointment giving way to awe. When Grace finished, the professor was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "That is one of the most remarkable voices I have ever heard, and I have heard many voices in my career. Mrs. Vance, I would still very much like to offer you the opportunity to study in Boston, to develop your gift formally." Grace smiled and shook her head. "Thank you, Professor, but my answer is still no. My voice is not meant for concert halls. It is meant for this family, for this life. I am exactly where I belong," Professor Alderson sighed. "I suspected you would say that." "Well, I cannot force you, though I think the world is poorer for not hearing your voice. But perhaps your children. Do any of them show musical aptitude?" Catherine, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. "I love to sing," she said shyly. Professor Alderson's eyes lit up. "Would you sing something for me, young lady?" Catherine looked at Grace, who nodded encouragingly. The little girl began to sing, her voice high and sweet and astonishingly pure. She had inherited her mother's gift completely, and Professor Alderson's face showed his recognition of it. "Remarkable," he said when she finished. "How old are you, Catherine?" 11, she replied. "When you are older, if you ever wish to study music formally, I hope you will write to me," Professor Alderson said. He produced a card and handed it to Grace. "I mean it. That child has a rare gift." After the professor left, Vincent and Grace talked long into the night about what had happened. "Do you think Catherine will want to go to Boston someday?" Vincent asked. Grace looked troubled. "I do not know. Part of me wants to keep her here forever, safe and near us. But another part of me knows that if she truly has a gift, it would be selfish to prevent her from developing it fully." "We will let her choose when the time comes," Vincent said. "Whatever she decides, we will support her." The years continued to pass, each one bringing new changes and challenges. Nathaniel married a local rancher's daughter and started his own property adjoining Vincent's land. Sarah fell in love with a horse trader from Wyoming and married him, moving away but visiting often. James discovered that his artistic talent could be applied to photography and opened a studio in town. And Catherine continued to sing, her voice growing stronger and more beautiful with each passing year. When she turned 18 in 1909, she came to Vincent and Grace with Professor Alderson's card in her hand. "I would like to write to him," she said. "I want to study music, to see what I might be capable of with proper training, but I do not want to disappoint you." Grace embraced her daughter. "You could never disappoint us. If this is what you want, then you must do it. Your voice is a gift, Catherine, and gifts are meant to be shared with the world." Catherine studied in Boston for 3 years, and her letters home were full of excitement and wonder at all she was learning. But she also expressed homesickness for Montana, for the wide open spaces and the clear air in her family. When she finished her studies in 1912, she returned home, not to stay forever but to visit and rest before beginning a concert career that would take her all over the country. Vincent and Grace, now in their 50s, watched their youngest child prepare to leave again with mixed emotions. Their house was quiet now, with all the children grown and gone, and while they had each other, they felt the absence of the noise and chaos that had defined their lives for so many years. The night before Catherine was to leave for her first concert tour, the whole family gathered at the ranch. All 4 children came, bringing their own families now. Nathaniel had 2 children, Sarah was expecting her 3rd, and James had recently married. They crowded into the house that had once seemed so large but now felt perfectly sized for the gathering. After dinner, they did what they had always done. They gathered around the piano and sang together, 3 generations of Vances blending their voices in harmony. Grace and Catherine sang a duet, their voices so similar that it was sometimes hard to tell them apart, and when they finished, there was not a dry eye in the room. Vincent looked around at his family, at the life he and Grace had built together, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was what mattered, not the size of the ranch or the money in the bank or any other measure of worldly success. This family, this love, this music, everything else was just details. Later, after the others had gone to bed, Vincent and Grace walked out to the field where they had first met, the same field where barley still grew in neat rows. It was a clear night, the stars brilliant overhead, and Grace began to sing softly, the same kind of song she had been singing that first evening 28 years before. Vincent listened, holding his wife's hand, and felt tears on his cheeks. Grace's voice had not changed, not really. It still had the power to move him, to reach inside and touch something profound. Her voice had become the music of his life in ways he could never have imagined that first evening, shaping not just his own existence but the lives of their children, and now their grandchildren. "Thank you," he said when Grace's song ended. "For what?" Grace asked. "For singing in my field that day, for staying, for giving me this life." Grace smiled up at him. "We gave each other life, Vincent. That is what love does. It makes us more than we could ever be alone." They stood together in the field under the stars, 2 people who had found each other by chance or fate or providence, whose voices had blended together to create something beautiful and enduring. Around them, the Montana night was alive with sound, the whisper of wind through the barley, the distant call of an owl, and underneath it all, the memory of music that would echo through generations. Vincent and Grace lived out their remaining years together in the house they had made a home. They watched their children thrive and their grandchildren grow. Catherine's concert career flourished, but she always came home to Montana between tours, and she always sang for her parents first, in the field where her mother had first sung. Vincent passed away peacefully in 1925 at the age of 67, surrounded by his family. His last words were to Grace, telling her that her voice had been the greatest gift of his life. Grace held his hand as he slipped away, singing softly to him as she had sung to him every day for 41 years. Grace lived another 8 years without Vincent, and though she mourned him deeply, she was never truly alone. Her children and grandchildren visited constantly, and she remained active in the community and the church choir. She continued to sing every day, telling anyone who asked that singing kept Vincent close to her, that she could feel him listening whenever she raised her voice. When Grace died in 1933 at the age of 74, Catherine sang at her funeral, a song that Grace had taught her as a child. The church was packed with people who had been touched by Grace's voice and her kindness over the decades. After the service, the family gathered at the ranch, and they all walked out to the barley field together. They stood in the place where Vincent had first heard Grace singing, and Catherine led them in song, all the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren raising their voices together. The sound drifted across the Montana landscape, carrying on the wind, a testament to a love that had begun with music and had created a legacy of song that would continue for generations to come. The ranch itself remained in the family, passed down through Nathaniel's line. The house was maintained carefully, with the photographs and mementos of Vincent and Grace preserved. Visitors who came to the property often remarked that if you stood in the field at dusk and listened carefully, you could still hear singing on the wind, a woman's voice pure and beautiful, and a man's rough baritone joining in harmony. Whether this was true or just a romantic story told by the family, no one could say for certain. But what was certain was that Vincent Vance and Grace Zimmerman Vance had found each other in a barley field in Montana in 1884, and that their love had created something that transcended their individual lives. Grace's voice had indeed become the music of Vincent's life, and through their children and grandchildren, that music continued to echo through time, a reminder that even in the hardest and loneliest of places, love can find a way, and a single voice can transform everything.